son. Great horror games such as Resident Evil, one of Capcom's greatest titles, since the release of Resident Evil 1 in 1996 on PlayStation 1, would really strive the way for horror games that quite naturally stand up against some of the best, such as Silent Hill. Of course, a lot of Resident Evil fans will naturally tell you that some of the best titles are Resident Evil 2 to, of course, the beloved Resident Evil 4. There's even many great spin-offs within the Resident Evil franchise, and there has been different directors throughout the time of making these games. When it comes to catching the ambience in the background and the set tone for these horror games, Resident Evil is leaps and bounds above most. Shinji Mikami, who is widely regarded as the godfather of the survival horror genre, and also the creator of Resident Evil, as well as being having in the hand of the many other classic horror franchises like Dino Crisis and Devil May Cry, Shinji Mikami has been in the video game industry for 30 years. He started his career at Capcom in the 1990s and worked out on several licensed games before directing his first project, Resident Evil, in 1996. The debut in the entry was the survival horror franchise, and it was revolutionary in a variety of ways, of course solidifying the game designer's legacy for generations to come. Of course, from the widely renowned Resident Evil 1, which was considered the best survival horror or one of the best survival horrors of its time, it would be massively inspired by Capcom's 1989 Sweet Home, which made its arrival onto the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. With Sweet Home being the first true survival horror game, since it utilized some of the most important survival horror aspects, it had QTE or Quick Cinematic Timed Events, anxiety-inducing gameplay, visuals, and a heart-wrenching ghost story to go with it. With its creaky door transitions, checking and finding random keys, and solving puzzles, and a heavy focus on inventory management, of course that's all here in this game. Resident Evil was originally conceived as a remake of Sweet Home, and as you might expect from the game that it was in direct inspiration, many of the elements seen in Capcom's 1996 breakout survival horror of Resident Evil 1. In order to capture the same ominous feeling Sweet Home created during its combat sections, Mikami decided to base Resident Evil around the first-person perspective. He believed it would give players a more terrifying experience whilst immersing them into the game. However, technical limitations and Capcom's inexperience with 3D modeling derailed Mikami's innovative idea. The team was unable to recreate Mikami's vision, causing him to rethink Resident Evil's entire structure. Mikami's new game seemed to come to a standstill until Alone in the Dark debuted in 1992. The up-and-coming game designer wanted to incorporate similar camera designs and pre-rendered backgrounds with his own game. The only problem was the layout forced Mikami to change how characters walked around the game's environment. Despite Mikami's reluctance, tank controls were implemented into the game. Although Mikami wasn't thrilled about the game's drastic overhaul, many of the new features would later become staples within the genre and change the course of horror games forever. A lot of Resident Evil fans would love this camera rendition, especially for its time, because if anything, it would add to the appeal of the horror aspect of the game, not knowing exactly what was coming around the corner, because the camera angle could have been fixed at a certain position, leaving you second-guessing what exactly you're running into. It's hard to imagine the original Resident Evil without all the distinctive characteristics that all the fans love. Whilst it wasn't the first horror game ever created, it paved the way for countless survival horror titles, which single-handedly revolutionizing the industry and paving the way for great games such as Resident Evil 2 and 3 and 4. Of course, after Resident Evil 1, these games would go on to do amazingly well, with Resident Evil 2 receiving critical acclaim with praise for its presentation, gameplay, and faithfulness to the original, and was of course nominated for several awards, including Game of the Year. With its lovable characters such as Claire Redfield and Leon Kennedy, with also built-in class visual and sound design, terrific voice performances, and control scheme, and that makes action tense and more satisfying, and of course, the clever puzzle schemes. And of course Resident Evil 3 featuring enhanced 3D character models and higher resolution graphics, with its typical style of horror and ambience alike, with its stunning visuals, haunting sound design, and not to mention the new dodge mechanics too, with the return of Jill Valentine and characters such as Carlos, not to mention that the whole thing is taking place within Raccoon City itself, and of course the unforgettable Umbrella's bioweapon, Nemesis. And as time would go by, as the new generations of consoles such as PlayStation 2 would be coming around, so would that be of Resident Evil 4 with its release in 2005. It is widely regarded as one of the best video games of all time. The game features a number of elements that make it stand out from other games in the genre. In gameplay, Resident Evil 4 introduced a new gameplay style that was different from the previous games in the series. It featured an over-the-shoulder camera that allowed for more precise aiming and shooting. The game also introduced quick-time events that added tension and excitement of the game. With undoubtedly the game's story is so well written and engaging, it would follow that of Leon S. Kennedy, a government agent, as he tries to rescue the president's daughter from a cult in Spain. The story is full of twists and turns that keeps the player engaged throughout the game. And of course, with its graphics, Resident Evil 4 was praised for when it was released. The game's environments are so detailed and immersive, and the character models are well designed, especially for its time for PlayStation 2. Not to mention the soundtrack. The game's soundtrack is atmospheric and adds to the tension of the horror game, also including 2 separate game modes such as Separate Ways and Mercenaries. And of course, the mysterious merchant would give us our weapons along the way in this action-packed, horror survival thrilling game that combined everything that made this game probably the best one out of the franchise. So what exactly is it that all these games I've just mentioned that have in common? Well, they stick to the traditionalism of what it was that made the first original Resident Evil game as great as it was. Aside from evolving it and making it more appealing and better and setting it in different tones and backgrounds which make each of these games unique to themselves. So where did it start to go wrong?
Town's gone to hell. The people here, they're acting like those Ganado detailed in the Kennedy report. Aside from that, there's something new, something we've never encountered before.
And of course, it's Resident Evil 5. You either love it or you hate it. The fan base is quite divided between how they feel about this game. And of course, that's completely fine, because some people are going to like aspects that others don't appreciate. Of course, on Metacritic, its score didn't do too bad, with some people appreciating what RE5 had to offer. But of course, I, amongst other people, felt like this game was its departure from the survival horror genre, and its focus was just sorely on action. I, amongst many, did actually enjoy this game. The co-op feature was absolutely fantastic. You could find yourself playing this for hours because the story is quite lengthy. And of course, the story in itself would actually be a major part of what Resident Evil is. But of course, they had its problems, such as the AI partner system, especially if you was playing on your own. It was a nightmare. Not to mention its over-top scenes with Chris punching boulders and shit. I think personally it relied on the success of RE4, a game that changed the pace of the game with more exploration-orientated survival horror, to mix that in with the action shooter, with of course some of the horror elements. RE4 was a breath of fresh air, but with RE5 they expanded it just to the point where it became a little too shooter and arcadey and action-orientated for a lot of people. To me and many others, it didn't feel like a Resident Evil game. It just lost the complete element of horror. Throughout the entire game, I didn't really find myself in horror or terror. I more or less found myself laughing at some of the cutscenes. This game's not even a bad game. It's actually fun to play if you're playing with friends especially. With Resident Evil 5 in the next coming game, the uncertainty of the franchise hanged in the balance for what this game was set to be. In 2012, Resident Evil 6 would make its arrival. Resident Evil 6 was a departure from the series in many ways, but largely because it focused on action rather than creepy horror. But Resident Evil 6 is the game that mostly received negative reviews. The game was criticized for being too action-orientated and losing survival horror elements that define the series. The game also suffers from poor level design and scripted events that make it frustrating and boring considering to some. However, some players did enjoy the game for its mechanics and consider it a decent third-person shooter. In all honesty, this game had quite fluid controls. In fact, the gameplay was really nice, with each different character having their own unique abilities. It's undeniably an ambitious game, but the pace and the structure feels so unhinged and unfocused that nothing ever feels like it's growing. It just feels like it's the next thing to the next thing. There's no doubt that Resident Evil 6 was the biggest departure from the survival horror that we all know and love, as the game had become so largely focused on action rather than it being a creepy horror. Resident Evil 6 just felt like a Hollywood movie. The game just felt full of cheap thrills instead of the intensifying story that we had from the previous game, with all the elements within the gameplay that were missing that made us feel helpless and lost, such as having to reserve ammunition. Whereas in Resident Evil 6, you could just find ammunition lying right there on the floor. The whole thing just felt like an entire walkthrough. Everything was mapped out, guided for you to find. Whilst it's still a great game, I don't think it deserves to be up there with some of the best Resident Evil games. Far from it. The game had its appeal in other ways. It had a better co-op system than Resident Evil 5, and there was more story playthroughs we could play with Chris and Ada and Leon and Jake Wesker. But one thing was for certain, that survival horror for Resident Evil looks like it was dead at this point.
My little girl is giving us a gift. And this gift is with me always.
So in 2017, Resident Evil was here. We all managed to get this game that we've been longing for, waiting for. In fact, everybody was wondering where Resident Evil had gone for this entire time. And with the announcement of the E3 trailer, naturally, everybody responded with great excitement for the return of the beloved game. Resident Evil 7 is exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, and a breathtaking return to form a series we long thought had abandoned any hope of redemption. It's been 6 years since Resident Evil 7 came out, and I myself had to go back and relive what made this game such a masterpiece. Having moved on from game console, I'd finally find myself on PC, and of course last October in Halloween I had to get this game again. Since Steam, everything was on offer during this time, and the only game I could think of getting that was worth really playing, it had to be Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 is a confident attempt at reinvention, but it's the way it channels the older games, particularly the first, that really makes it great. It takes an industrial pressure washer to the series, blasting off years of accumulated filth and grime, and you're left with a lean, polished survival horror that borrows from its legacy, but isn't afraid to look modern horror games for inspiration too. This understated opening immediately sets the tone for Resident Evil 7. As we're entering the Baker residence, we can see that it's been quite lived in for some time. With the door locking behind us, it just adds the sense of appeal and scare. Already at the start of the game, we have exactly the same kind of feeling we did in Resident Evil 1. It's the feeling of the unknown, and some kind of nagging tension that overhangs in the balance. Of course, most noticeably, we've gathered that this game is in first-person view. Exactly what Shinji Mikami expected to have in the first Resident Evil game. Of course, would now finally become a reality in modern-day technology that would make such things as controls and graphics easily more improved on by today's standards of easily accessible technology than they could back then. Resident Evil 7 just felt like an instant connection to the previous titles before. Something felt more isolated than any other game. Aside from the house being completely abandoned, we ourselves felt trapped, enclosed, in mystery. The level of confidence you have in this game is questionably a thing, because we're seeing it through the eyes of a person we don't understand or even know his capabilities. It's not like that of Chris or Leon, where we know they've got some form of military experience. We're just a man out here trying to look for our wife. One thing that I really adore about this game in particular is we're starting this game with no weapons, just a torch and some items we're finding along the way to try and suss out exactly what is going on. As you're making yourself for the Baker residence, you can really see the attention to detail in which it tries to capture the horror element of which is the background that we're in. With a house that seems like it hasn't been clearly renovated for some time, we wouldn't expect the horrors that would come within. It was equally refreshing having to search around, especially at the bottom part of the Baker residence, to find the bolt cutters, in a way to access certain levels within the game. The sense of interaction and investigation just felt exactly like the old game.
Ethan?
Are you alright?
You shouldn't be here.
What do you mean? You contacted me.
No, I wouldn't. Did I? Did anyone see you? Did he see you?
Hey, who else is here? What the hell's going on?
Daddy's coming. We need to go.
Daddy?
We need to go now!
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared within these moments of this game. I had played this previously on console and I know what to expect. Coming back and playing this game, and I'm sure others can vouch, just gives you a sense of PTSD, because the horror element in itself, no matter how many times you play it, is always still there. Interaction is a must in this game, because naturally as a human being, being in an environment you don't understand, you're clearly going to need something to try and want to protect yourself with. And with trying to get items that seem so scarce, your panic and anxiety is just elevated all the more. Already at the beginning of the game, we are just thrown into the deep end. We finally managed to get our hand on an axe, a weapon, and it's fair to say that the control scheme in itself is really nice and simple, with realistic animations that make it feel like any other Resident Evil game like before. The sense of survival is real. Really, one cool feature as well that I love about this game is the fact that it included videotapes. Videotapes that you could find around the house. One thing that is enjoyable is the fact it doesn't feel like Resident Evil 5 or 6. It's not a mandatory waypoint, it's more of a search and find. And these certain clues can give you a good idea of what you're in for later in the game. It's really just the simple, subtle things in this game, such as seeing silhouettes, and by the time you peek round the corner, nothing's there, just adding to the sense of urgency. You know it's scary when you're gripping your controller with your adrenaline at an all-time high, with your fingers on the trigger, awaiting what's gonna come next.
It fucking hurts!
Considering what we've run into from what I can only imagine seems like some kind of possession, instead of what we're usually used to in Resident Evil, which is zombies, we find ourselves getting a gun, which yes at the time feels great, but also in the back of your mind you're thinking, well, will it be enough to do the job? But it just adds to that sense of security we feel, even if it is minuscule. Of course I paused the game because I shit myself. Not literally, but in a sense, because when that happened I wasn't expecting that kind of jump scare. Jump scares are quite usually lousy and a cheap way to get a scare out of the audience, but Resident Evil uses it really well. Felt quite bad for double tapping my wife in the head. I mean, she was acting batshit insane, and at this point in time, I didn't really understand what was going on, like many of us. But it's fair to say that the gunplay and the shooting in this game is absolutely phenomenal, given on the fact that Resident Evil is usually a third-person shooter. With the incorporation of the RE engine, first-person shooting with something that would really go really well with Resident Evil, making it really realistic in terms of how you shoot, the recoil and ammo preservation you have to take in mind.
Dumb son bitch wasn't no good if it hit him.
Yes.
Not again.
Get out the way, Margaret.
The introduction to the Baker family was frightening. I mean, you were surrounded by this crazy family that awfully reminded me of something out of Chainsaw Massacre. You could only see what appeared to be human corpses and intestines lying around on the table, what appears to be some kind of big feast to welcome you to the family. I so loved how refreshing the whole thing was. It wasn't like your typical Resident Evil games where it was just over-the-top zombies. The director of RE7 was Koshi Nakaishi. It really paid homage to Shinji Mikami's original idea on Resident Evil by implementing a more human side to the characters. Quote Shinji Mikami, "I'm interested in vulnerable characters in normal human beings. The horror experience is more scary when the player really isn't sure whether their character is going to live or die. Death and survival need to be on constant seesaw. If it's a situation where you're not 100% sure that you can avoid or defeat the enemies, if you feel maybe there's a chance you'll make it. That's where horror lies. Creating the situation is vital. Also, I don't want to just stand out there shooting dozens of enemies. Back in the early days when I was making the first Resident Evil, I spent 3 months studying the psychology of horror. But what I've learned is horror is instinctive. The things that scare me take precedence over the theory of horror. With Resident Evil, we went with human and human-shaped enemies because people are generally more interested and scared by other people rather than some obscure creature we don't recognize. End quote. Things can go massively overlooked in Resident Evil because there's a lot more attention to detail than we know. Such as looking on the refrigerator, you can see that they've actually got dates and the name of the people they've been using to make meat and food out of, in a sense, cannibalism. It's evidently freaky when you're walking around and you realize that Jack Baker is on the prowl and on the loose. And at any minute that any door that you might open, you might just run into him. Adding to the level of intensity, unlike Resident Evil 5 and 6, which is just a pure shoot 'em up where dozens of enemies are coming at you and you can just blast them down with an LMG.
Sit up before dinner was done.
You know, a game is really well done when there is never a dull moment. Fighting Jack Baker is so intense throughout the entirety of the situation, and the whole level design in itself and how you fight him is very different from that what we're used to on previous games. When you're fighting Jack Baker in this moment, you can actually get the car keys and drive the car around. If you're not good under pressure, don't start the car in time. Jack will take the wheel himself. Background and theme of Resident Evil 7 is admirable, with it being set in Dovely, an American small town in Louisiana, an old former mining town if you will. I just love the whole Southern American aesthetic. It really adds to the appeal of the horror. Jack Baker seeming so unhinged, the southern accent that he has really adds to the element of scare.
You're about to see some more.
Fuck!
Resident Evil rarely remains faithful to the original games. It's almost like a rebirth, a recreation, a phoenix in the ashes. The Baker house in itself is huge. You find yourself looking around in certain areas for quite some time, especially when you first play this game. Back and forth exploration is what made these games what they are. Finding yourself returning to a certain location to unlock sections of the rooms, certain doors. And of course, side objectives like getting certain weapons that of course always come with some kind of puzzle and a catch. Wherever you found yourself in the Baker residence did not feel safe at all. When you found your way up the stairs and you felt like you was out of harm's way, subconsciously you always knew somebody was lurking around, waiting for you. The perfect thing about Resident Evil 7 as well is that it throws you into the unknown. We don't really have much of an idea behind the Baker family or the events that have been happening prior to our arrival, but roaming around the entire residence, picking up books and certain articles, you can get a good understanding of the events that have been taking place here. The beauty of this is not everything's being briefed. It's like an investigation the entire time. The puzzles in Resident Evil 7 are a nice little compliment and a good homage to the original Resident Evil games. I mean, these puzzles themselves are not exactly the hardest puzzles to achieve compared to the earlier games, but the engagement with the puzzles is a nice returning feature. There's something really thrilling about finding secret rooms in the Baker residence and traversing through different parts of the environment. In Resident Evil 7, we also have something called the Molded, which are practically most of the NPC enemies we face along the way. The Molded are mobile colonies of mold, a hyper-evolved fungus generated by E001, and presumably other E-type bioweapons. The Baker family mass-produced them by kidnapping people and disposing of their bodies in bathtubs filled with mold. Hence all the letters you find round the Baker residence, which confirms of the missing people.
so quickly along the line.
Naturally, in this game, you'll encounter Jack Baker several times. If he's not walking around the mansion, at some point you're gonna have some kind of a boss battle with him. No one can deny the brilliance of this boss battle in itself. It made you feel vulnerable. Your adrenaline was racing, your heart was racing. You could say this had you in a fight and flight situation mode. What's noticeably refreshing about Resident Evil 7 is it really does go back to its core roots of Resident Evil 1. You're not just fighting big bio-mutant, super-mutant monsters with big giant eyeballs. You're up against something more close to home, another human being. With the development of the RE engine and the way that it was implemented into RE7, there is no doubt that they did such a wonderful job of bringing out exactly what it is to make this game so horrifying. From the sound effects to the visual effects, everything really does just hit a really horrific tone in the game. With the gruesome gore and the blood splatter that you can see all over the weaponry, it's really truly fascinating to see how such visuals really do make an impact.
Do me a favor and stay dead.
So not only do we have the Baker residence, at some point in the game we eventually make it outside the residence, which only just makes the appeal of this game so much better, as we're not just stuck in one environment, we're heading outside the environment, into an open and known experience, which in fact can just elevate the tension all that more. Of course, with the save room systems too, for where we can save the game, the Baker's trailer was a nice little feature. And in your journeys, if you found the antique coins, you could use them within the cages to unlock guns and health bonuses and strength bonuses. I really like how it had to incorporate you finding these coins, unlike Resident Evil 5 and 6 where you just get points to be able to buy your skills and perks. It felt really challenging. At some point you'll find yourself at the next section of the Baker residence, towards the greenhouse where you'll face Marguerite. She's infested with bugs and insects, so if anyone's got some kind of insect phobia, you're going to be in for a nightmare here. Of course, this game requires you to get the flamethrower, because there's certain cupboards you need to enter, but in doing so, you need to use the flamethrower to get rid of the insects. It's definitely a lot harder than fighting Jack Baker at the first fight that you have back at the main Baker residence. It's pretty tough. So stocking up on ammunitions and weaponry is definitely a must. There's a grimy, almost tangible realism to the visuals, and the audio design is sensational too. You can easily track the shuffling footsteps of the enemy by ear, gauging where they are based on sound alone. And the creaking floorboards and sinister sounds that echo around you can only add to the rumbling sense of dread felt in every room of this dreary homestead.
Now, if you want the head, feel free to come by any time and I'll give it to you. But only if you participate in a little activity I put together just for you.
The pacing in Resident Evil 7 is done amazingly well. The typical Resident Evil fashion of backtracking into certain sections to advance to the next section of your task, on being within inside the residence to outside the residence, as you're tasked by Lucas to gather the keycard you need to play his little game. The interaction within the environment of the residence in itself is so much more than just grabbing keys and objects. For instance, you're having to use different things such as the clock in order to help you figure out the time to advance to a next part of the section of the game that really just adds to the immersive experience of this horror survival. One of my favorite things about video games, as you can probably all agree, is the freedom of choice. As it is with the VHS tapes here, as being able to find clues that you need to advance. But more than ever, it's particularly important, especially when you're up against Lucas's little experiment, or game should we say. I remember my previous playthrough on the PlayStation, and I actually died because I didn't get to look at this VHS tape, which gives you so many clues for your survival. Like for example, in the VHS tape, the survivor is trying to figure a way out of this room. And in doing so, you need the wind-up mechanism, which is the required tool you'll need in order to obtain the password. But if you played the VHS tape, you already know the password, hence then you don't need to pull the wind-up mechanism out of the barrel which contains all the fuel which sets the entire room in flames. It's fair to say at this part of the game in Resident Evil 7 that this really does test your strength, your skill, your intelligence, because the entire section with Lucas, the entire building is laced with booby traps, wires, bombs, explosives, zombies, hell, even containers containing ammo. The thing is, you need to have your wits about you at all time, and that's what I love about this game. You don't know what to expect, but at the same time, this game will leave clues for you to get a good profile on how the bakers work.
0621. No, it's 0514. Oh, come on, take a chance, you never know. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock.
Best part of the entire game for me is definitely the Lucas section. It really does keep you engaged and on your toes. You have to react quickly in precise, critical moments. And surviving this certain game that we have to play just adds to the level of intensity of surviving.
Hey, one of those is mine.
Mostly in the last spurt of the game where you have an abundance of ammunition and can merely shoot any monstrosity that crosses your path. These sections almost feel like a reward for your many hours of careful ammo conservation and patient sneaking and a hugely cathartic but just as delighting in your new profound power to overcome certain obstacles and enemies. It's nice to see that Resident Evil wouldn't incorporate too much of these big giant mutants with massive eyeballs that you have to constantly keep taking down, and the fact that it would keep it limited and make it so good that the pacing in itself would work nicely together so that by the time you've gathered most of your weapons, you'd be ready to face on these big such giant bioweapons.
There's only one left. There can't just be one left.
What the hell are we gonna do now?
And with Resident Evil stories containing different kinds of viruses, the serum would be used from 2 ingredients from a D-series test subject and contains the necessary antibodies to fight the infection that Evelyn would spread throughout the Baker mansion. The pacing of the story is done so well that at this point we don't exactly know the bigger picture of what is happening, and of course towards the end we get the big reveal. By the game not giving away so much, it keeps us playing more and invested into the story. And towards the end of the game, we'll come to the tanker, where we play as Mia, with some people saying that the size of the area feels big compared to the amount that you actually have to do. Lots of empty rooms and multiple floors. Some feel as if it drags on from what we've been through at the start of the game, because it's quite easy to get lost within the tanker with how dark and dreary the place is. But undoubtedly, the boat section was a great thing to have. It just opened up a whole new environment for us to interact with and navigate around. We had more of the molded we had to face, with more harder challenges to try and get through. Of course, we had a new array of weapons such as a machine gun and explosives to proceed through. Plus, it was cool to get a different take to play as a different character entirely as well. But most importantly, it serves to add towards the element of the importance of the story by playing in the tanker.
But Evelyn!
Fucking hallucinations. Where is she?
Some people, they felt like it was unnecessary that we had to play 2 sections within the tanker, because it should have been like a VHS tape where we could have put the tape in and actually seen what happened in the past if we chose to. Story is fantastic, and Evelyn would make Mia watch the videotape to restore her memory, as it revealed that Mia was in fact working for an unnamed corporation that was developing Evelyn as a bioweapon. So it was her job to oversee Evelyn as she was being covertly transported to Central America on board the tanker ship. Mia realizing her role in creating Evelyn, Mia would rescue Ethan and hands him a vial containing Evelyn's DNA. She manages to resist Evelyn control long enough for Ethan to escape off the ship to finally put an end to this bioweapon.
What's this?
I won't be able to resist for much longer.
Leah, no. No.
Transitions into the different sections of Resident Evil really do tie in quite nicely, because we do get a good starter and a main when it comes to survival horror. But towards the end of the game, we finally get to enjoy some of the action-orientated survival side of it all by actually going into the salt mines, which was probably one of the underrated parts within the game. Because in typical Resident Evil fashion, we come to discover there's a secret lab down below from where we get to see the truth behind this entire event that's taken place. The mine section was really truly refreshing, because now once we've gathered all our weapons and tools for all that hard work, we could finally put them to good use. But it really did feel like a race against time as we were trying to find Evelyn, dodging tons upon molded to try and survive. So none of the elements were lost. In fact, all it did was just add that action appeal that made it fun, so that all the weapons and items we gathered along the way could be used towards the end of the game. It's truly fantastic, because if there's one thing that Resident Evil 7 got right, was the pacing. And of course with the hunt for Evelyn, it just really did set the tone, especially heading back into the Baker Mansion from where it all began, and finally administering the very thing that would supposedly keep her down and out, at least for now.
Time's over.
Resident Evil 7's finale was absolutely amazing. It was strange to see the Umbrella Corporation coming to our rescue, considering that they're the ones who are usually behind this biovirus. But none of us were expecting at the very end of the game that we would come across Chris Redfield. I assumed at this time in the game that this wasn't going to be canon and completely be a separate story to the Resident Evil franchise. But man, was I wrong.
Ethan, in Redfield. We'll have you found him.
First, I wasn't too sure if that was Chris Redfield. I mean, the character design looked completely nothing like him. Not too sure what Capcom was thinking by making Chris Redfield a completely different character model. But either way, it was nice to know that we could see some of the returning faces from the original game, and then also just tying in this game into the entire franchise. It really was a beautiful, refreshing take to make this game become brand new, but at the same time contain all the things about it that made us love it to begin with. And of course that wouldn't be all. RE7 would offer extra content, additional DLC that we could play, such as Chris Redfield's story within the mines, or Jack Baker's brother rescuing Zoe, with cool additional features and different gameplay elements. It's truly telling on how much this game really did revive the Resident Evil franchise. And it's amazing to say that we've actually got this game back to where we originally wanted it to be, and it truly has got its redemption. This is it for today's video, guys. I'd love to hear your comments down below on what you thought of Resident Evil 7 and what you liked about it. Well, anyway, this is the Voice Box, and I'll see you all soon.